Back around the turn of the millennium, when I was growing up, most of the kids I knew, including myself, had a pretty simplistic idea of the history of video games, which ran something like this. Video games were invented in the 1970s by a company called Atari. You had to play them with a joystick and a single action button through the Atari 2600, which had fake wood grain on it like a station wagon for some reason. And most of the games were really boring, but the whole thing was still incredibly popular, because kids had to do something in between playing Little League Baseball and watching Happy Days on TV. This golden age ended in 1983, when Atari ruined everything by releasing a really crappy version of Pac-Man and some horrible tie-in game based on E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Video game sales tanked, a mountain of unsold cartridges had to be buried out in the desert somewhere, and after that, for several years, nobody played any video games. They just read comic books and played with He-Man action figures. Accounts differed as to whether anyone watched the TV show. Then, in 1980-whatever, Nintendo came out of nowhere and released the Nintendo Entertainment System, which saved the console market with its revolutionary concept of actually making good video games for a change. For the next half a decade, Nintendo was the bomb diggity as far as games were concerned, so much so that adults would call every video game a Nintendo. Until, in 1991, Sega came out of nowhere with the Sega Genesis and its mascot Sonic the Hedgehog, who represented a totally new paradigm in video gaming, namely that games could be cool and edgy and scare your mom while also being fun. This kicked off the so-called console war, which was sort of like the Civil War, except more important because it involved video games. Kids split into two rival camps, Sega and Nintendo, and if you spoke your mind too freely on the wrong side of the playground, you could easily find yourself in the midst of a nasty argument, or worse, a noogie. Neither side definitively won this war. Instead, it was ended by the entrance of a third player which came out of nowhere, Sony and its PlayStation, which not only had 3D games, but also could play CDs. Only really cool kids in 1995 had CDs, so both Nintendo and Sega agreed that Sony had taken first place, and from then on they would battle for second. There were still a lot of die-hard Nintendo fans who clung to the belief that PlayStation games sucked, and the N64 was way better. But Sega fans gradually shriveled up and disappeared over the late 90s, to be replaced by Sony kids who wore their baseball caps sideways and unironically used words like dope. And that takes us to the year 2000, when video games entered a far less funky fresh state of existence. But more importantly, my friends and I started to grow up and develop a less stereotypical view of gaming history. Now, the story I've just told you is sort of accurate in broad strokes. Atari really did dominate the home console market in the late 70s, as did Nintendo in the late 80s. Sega really did swipe a lot of the market away from Nintendo by releasing the Genesis and Sonic the Hedgehog. E.T. for the Atari 2600 really was a god-awful video game. But as a history of gaming, the 90s kid approach suffers from two fundamental flaws. First of all, it was only even partially true about the American market specifically. The United States is where the video game crash of 1983 happened. Europe hardly noticed it, as did Japan, the original home of all three combatants in the console wars. In Europe, from the late 70s through the turn of the millennium, dedicated video game consoles weren't nearly as popular as personal computers that could also play games. Devices similar to the American Commodore 64, which I knew nothing about as a kid, even though it was the single best-selling computer model ever produced. Meanwhile, in Japan, there were many alternatives to the Famicom throughout the 80s, some made by companies you've never heard of, like Epic and Nichibutsu, while others were produced by long-standing Nintendo rivals, like Tomy, Bandai, and Sega. Nintendo may have been more comfortable making games for its Japanese customers, but because of abundant competition, these were also the ones it had to work hardest to hold on to. No Japanese adult in the 80s could have imagined using Nintendo as a synonym for video game. And yet, by the late 80s, Nintendo was just as dominant in Japan as it was in the US, and it would hold on to this lead well into the following decade. Sega never cracked Nintendo's stranglehold in the home market. It was Sony that finally cut the big end down to size years later, trampling Sega at the same time. But the second problem is the bigger one. The story I opened this video with leaves out so many real-life details that it twists Nintendo's history into a caricature of itself. Saying that Nintendo came out of nowhere in 1985 amounts to saying that Nintendo suddenly became super creative out of nowhere, and that this creativity is owed solely to its own internal workings. It also implies that Nintendo didn't do anything worthy of note until 1985. Presenting Sega's history with Nintendo as nothing but cutthroat competition is another massive distortion, one that only makes sense if you completely disregard everything Sega did prior to 1989. Viewing the history of home video games in this way turns success into something that just seems to light on companies randomly, stick around for a few years, and then fly somewhere else. You might as well say that Atari was big in the 70s because it had a magical Chia Pet that made everybody like its video games, and then it lost the Chia Pet in a ditch, so the crash happened. Nintendo went digging in the ditch and managed to get it later on, but then Sega found out about the Chia Pet and tried to take it away, so they fought over it for 4 years until they were so worn out that Sony could come along and seize the magical knick-knack for itself. That's not how business works, and it's certainly not how creativity works. So if you want to understand how Nintendo has been so successful for so many years, you have to dig into its history thoroughly and come up with some insights deeper than the NES was a great console and Nintendo just built on that success. I made this series of videos partly because I find Nintendo's history inherently fascinating, but I also did it to look for answers to some questions. What was it that made the NES such a special console? What are the roots of Nintendo's unique magic, which lots of people recognize but few seem able to fully comprehend? And how much of this classic magic, if any, survives in the Nintendo of the present day? We've gone over nearly a century of Nintendo's history, from its origins as a card manufacturer to the rise of Hiroshi Yamauchi and his experiments with other products, to Nintendo's early success with toys, to its struggles and growing pains making electronic games, and eventual worldwide prominence with the Game & Watch series. The discussion has included basically every major product that Nintendo put out before the NES, and that puts us in an ideal position to address that first question. What made the NES a great video game console? To begin with, it's important to distinguish here between the original Japanese Famicom and the American Nintendo Entertainment System. While the two consoles are very similar in terms of hardware, the simple fact that the Famicom came out several years earlier makes it different from a software and especially a marketing perspective. When the Famicom originally launched in Japan, it only had 3 games. All were ports of arcade titles, and as far as branding was concerned, they were all tied into Nintendo's most successful arcade game up to this point, Donkey Kong. The first was a home version of Donkey Kong, the second a port of its sequel, Donkey Kong Jr., and the third a licensed Popeye game, which is what Shigeru Miyamoto and his team had originally been working on back in 1981 before they switched gears and turned that game into Donkey Kong. Up to this point, every really successful home console had depended on a back catalog of established arcade hits. The Atari 2600 was carried in its early years by Breakout, Space Invaders, and even Pac-Man, which despite being an awful port is still the console's best-selling game. It took years for dedicated home console titles like Adventure and Pitfall to strike a chord with 2600 players, and even then, Pitfall was the only non-arcade game whose sales topped the charts. A more innovative approach had been tried by Fairchild Semiconductor in the mid-1970s, when it released the Channel F, the first home console to feature interchangeable game cartridges. The Channel F's library was nothing but original titles, including genres almost never seen in the arcade, like puzzle games, although admittedly there were a few Pong clones in there too. But the Channel F was also generally considered a failure, only selling about 350,000 systems in the 7 years of its existence. It finally gave up the ghost in 1983, when most second-generation consoles were wiped out by the American crash. Nintendo's first successful home console, the Color TV game, wasn't like that at all. It was just a collection of Pong clones, released 2 years after Atari's own Home Pong unit. And the Famicom, at least initially, wasn't much more adventurous. Even its original name, the home cassette-type video game Family Computer, made it sound like a variation of the earlier Color TV games. And when you look at its library, what it resembles more than anything else is the Atari 2600, starting off with ports of Nintendo's own arcade hits, then branching out into ports of other companies' arcade hits, and a small assortment of original games made internally or by close partners. The Famicom's initial appeal wasn't based on uniqueness, or at least not unique software. It was the combination of high-quality hardware that could produce a better simulation of arcade graphics and sound, and a relatively low price point, which made it a good deal. It shared this emphasis on bringing the arcade game experience into the home with the Atari 2600. The Famicom just did it better. And funnily enough, this niche would later be taken over by Sega, whose Genesis was even better at it than the NES was. If there had never been a crash in the United States, the NES would probably have been a lot more like the Famicom, which is to say like a better version of the Atari 2600. But in the US in 1985, Atari's reputation was radioactive. Hiroshi Yamauchi wasn't too far away from the fallout to realize that Nintendo's success in the American market probably depended on not looking like Atari. So he instructed the team at Nintendo of America to be very careful about how they marketed this device, and part of the process was something they hadn't been able to do with the Famicom, selecting which games to include in the launch lineup. By the time the NES was test marketed in New York City, October of 1985, there were dozens of Famicom games. Among these were numerous ports of hit arcade games, some produced internally by Nintendo, and others by its former and future rivals, Namco's Galaga and Dig Dug, Taito's Space Invaders and Elevator Action, Konami's Track and Field, Hudson's Lode Runner. Okay, technically that's a computer game, but you get the point. Howard Phillips, Nintendo's point man for public relations in the US, picked none of these for the launch of the NES. Not a single one. A few years earlier, this choice would have seemed crazy. Heck, it probably seemed a little crazy even in 1985. But Phillips' reasoning was that the US market had clearly had enough arcade ports for one generation. Kids who wanted to play Space Invaders all day had had 7 years to buy a game console or hang around in the arcade until they were sick of it. Nintendo's management had already been burned before by trying to cash in on an overripe trend, when they tried to push the generic shooter Radar Scope in 1980 and almost bankrupted their American division. What had pulled Nintendo back from the brink was a totally new kind of game, Donkey Kong, and no doubt Phillips was thinking that this was what they needed more of. Nintendo's greatest advantage in 1985 was the element of surprise. Video games had been developing technologically for the entire period that customers had been alienated from them in the United States, and it was now possible to really blow people's minds by showing them games that couldn't have been made in 1982. But that meant you had to avoid the temptation to kick things off with Pac-Man and Space Invaders, no matter how successful they had once been, because everyone had already seen them before. And on the other hand, look at Nintendo's actual best-selling product from the last 5 years, which wasn't Donkey Kong, but the Game & Watch series. These were all internally developed games that took advantage of the creativity of Nintendo's employees, rather than external partners. They were low-tech and they were silly, but every one was based on a different concept, so the sense of surprise and wonder, as well as diversity, was always there. And notably unlike the Famicom, the NES would have an exceptionally diverse launch lineup of 17 games, different not just in terms of genre, but also the inspiration for each. 4 of these games are arcadey titles, not that different from what was being put out by rivals like Namco and Konami at the same time. Clu Clu Land, Ice Climber, Kung Fu, and Wrecking Crew. Another 3 are sports games, which simulate experiences that hadn't been common in arcades before. Excite Bike, Baseball, and Golf. And of course, we have Super Mario Bros., a legendary game both then and now for many excellent reasons. But it's the other 9 games that I find really interesting here, because they're all at least partly inspired by an aspect of Nintendo's history that I never knew about as a kid, its experience making toys and games decades earlier. In addition to the 3 sports games mentioned earlier, there are 3 others which had been popular as arcade games dating back to the pre-electronic era, in fact, the quintessential tabletop sports games: soccer, football, and tennis. Remember that Nintendo had produced an electromechanical tennis game in 1977, and its rival, Taito, was world-renowned for its Crown Soccer and Crown Football arcade machines in the late 60s. We also have 3 gun games included in the lineup, designed to make use of the Zapper peripheral, and clearly indebted to the arcade gun games which Nintendo made in the 70s, as well as its Kosenju toys: Wild Gunman, Hogan's Alley, and Duck Hunt, the last of which was chosen as a pack-in game, and became so successful that it ended up being bundled with Super Mario Bros. Of all things. And there was also Pinball, the most iconic electronic arcade game ever, which Nintendo would stick with for many years to come, and apply to licenses like Kirby, Mario, Pokémon, and Metroid Prime. And finally, we have 2 games that were specifically designed to hook the American market, along with a totally unique peripheral. These were Stack Up and Gyromite, which both required the use of Nintendo's ET-like robot, the Robotic Operating Buddy, or ROB. Now this is a toy, one that drew on Gunpei Yokoi's history of designing cute, quirky toys to appeal to a market that video game developers hadn't tried to cultivate before. I'm going to be blunt and say that Nintendo probably didn't expect a lot of people to actually buy Rob or his games. He was there as a brand mascot, and a signal of Nintendo's charm and family friendliness, the things that distinguished them from Atari, from contemporary arcade games, and from most popular computer games on the market. It was part of Nintendo's general strategy of presenting the NES as radically different from all its competitors, past and present. The Famicom, by contrast, had started out as a typical high-tech arcade simulator, and only gradually built up a sense that it was more than that. By the time Nintendo moved on to making boundary-pushing experiences like Metroid and The Legend of Zelda, it had left the original Famicom concept behind and was working with the Famicom Disk System. This was an expensive machine that was half peripheral and half new console, and it was nothing like the hit that the Famicom had been, or that the NES eventually would be. For several years, Nintendo's release strategy in Japan was jarringly different from what it was in the US, mostly because the Disk System stood in between the 2 markets. Many classic first-party Nintendo games never made it to the original Famicom, while being critically important to the NES. And this meant that, oddly, more American kids played these games and actually saw them as classic. Japanese gamers were using their Famicoms to play Dragon Quest and Adventure Island, while American gamers played Mario and Zelda. Nintendo dominated the Japanese market for a decade with a series of careful strategic decisions. The way it dominated the American market, for a briefer time but with much more flair, was to be wildly innovative and insist upon itself until it became a household word. Ironically, the American version of Nintendo at this time had more of its own personality and felt more unique than the Japanese one it was based on. Which brings me back to that second question I posed earlier. What's at the root of Nintendo's unique appeal as a game company? This is an oversimplification, but based on the ground we've covered in this series, the best way I can put it is that Nintendo was a company that crossed boundaries. Regional boundaries, industry boundaries, genre boundaries. During its golden age, if you had a boundary, Nintendo would cross it. When it started to make toys, they felt a lot like the playing cards it had made before. Its first electronic games were toy-like, and its earliest video games were really mechanical, while the NES's launch lineup drew from all the industries Nintendo had ever dabbled in, going all the way back to cards. Sometimes this made its products feel really strange, and sometimes they didn't connect with customers the way Hiroshi Yamauchi had hoped they would, but they were unfailingly unique. Nintendo was never the best at any one thing, but it could find a different way to do almost anything that had been done before, and it often had a head start in doing the things that no one had done before. That's the artistic benefit that Nintendo got from having dipped into so many different industries, but there were business benefits too. Each market that Nintendo grew out of acted as a safety net that allowed its designers to take risks, secure in the knowledge that Nintendo could survive a reversal of fortune by continuing to make simple products with a reliable customer base that already liked and trusted them. It's a very conservative business strategy that kept Nintendo from fully cashing in on any trend, but it also kept it out of a lot of the pitfalls that rivals like Sega stumbled into for years on end. Speaking of which, another asset that Nintendo developed in its early years was its knowledge of companies like Sega, which were potential rivals, but also potential partners. When you look at a list of the third parties that produced games for the NES, it reads like a who's who of arcade game developers who had once been in a position to knock Nintendo out of the American market. Namco, Taito, Konami, Capcom, Data East, Hudson Soft. All of these companies had competed with Nintendo before. Some of them, like Hudson, would soon produce their own consoles and try to take market share away from Nintendo again. But even Sega, its mortal enemy, had helped it out in the past, publishing Wild Gunman in the United States at a time when Nintendo desperately needed a hit. A big reason why Sega was able to take so much of the market away from Nintendo in 1991 was that the two companies were actually a lot alike. They both had a long history of dabbling in several different markets, connected only by being related to children's entertainment. Both had a strong presence in the United States, Sega because of how it was founded, and Nintendo because it deliberately cultivated one. Both were familiar with having to produce a wide variety of games for their own consoles due to being starved of third-party support. And by the early 90s, both were promoting themselves as creative powerhouses with a unique take on gaming, not just the owners of a platform for playing other people's games. So why is Nintendo still going strong, decades after Sega was forced to abandon the hardware business? Sega is still an important game developer and publisher today, but it's much smaller than Nintendo, and nowhere near as prominent as it was in the 90s. What did Nintendo have that Sega didn't? There's something to be said for Nintendo's creative talent, people like Gunpei Yokoi, Genyo Takeda, and Shigeru Miyamoto. But Sega had its fair share of talented designers too, Yuji Naka, Naoto Oshima, and Yu Suzuki, among others. So I think Nintendo's real secret weapon was its president, Hiroshi Yamauchi. By the time the NES launched in the United States, Yamauchi was 58 years old, and had spent 36 of those years running Nintendo. During much of that time, he was constantly branching out into new businesses, and dealing with the endless problems that this expansion created. Not every business he went into was an immediate hit, and some, like running entertainment centers based on cutting-edge game technology, were disastrous. But one thing I noticed while making these videos was that he never permanently abandoned an idea that had potential. In the face of setbacks, he might set it aside temporarily and focus on other things, but he never gave up on a good idea. Yamauchi was not a particularly pleasant man to be around. He was arrogant, autocratic, and judgmental. He had little of the charisma you find in executives like Walt Disney or Steve Jobs. In interviews, he comes across as tight-lipped and calculating, in many ways the stereotypical Japanese businessman. And although his company was famous for its video games, he had no personal interest in them at all. He's known to have played one video game in his entire life, a simulation of the board game Go, which was released in 1987 on the Famicom. To Yamauchi, games were toys for children, but what made him a visionary was that he wanted Nintendo's games to be the best toys, the most fun to play with. This had been his goal since the 60s, when Nintendo made literal physical toys, and the virtualization of the past 2 decades hadn't changed his mind at all. In his eyes, you didn't need to see games as art to want to push the envelope with them. Toys might not be art, but they were constantly evolving and appealing to kids in new ways. That's what Yamauchi was willing to put himself and his employees through the ringer in order to accomplish. And there was a positive side to his being so judgmental, too. Because Yamauchi believed in his judgments, once he chose someone to do a job, he trusted them to do it well. In the 1960s, he put Gunpei Yokoi in charge of designing toys, a decision that would have far-reaching implications for Nintendo's future, just like when he chose Minoru Arakawa to lead Nintendo of America in 1980, and Shigeru Miyamoto to make Donkey Kong in 1981. When it was time for him to retire in the early 2000s, he took another calculated risk by tapping Satoru Iwata, formerly of HAL Laboratory, to succeed him, marking the first time in Nintendo's 110-year history that it would be run by someone outside the Yamauchi family. Iwata was a much friendlier and more charming president than Yamauchi had been, and his death in 2015 has been keenly felt by many old Nintendo fans. But in all the discussion over what Nintendo lost with Iwata, there's a point that's been missed. What Nintendo had already lost when Yamauchi retired from its board in the mid-2000s. With Yamauchi gone, Nintendo lost the connection it had to its multifarious past as a maker of toys and games. It lost the wisdom that Yamauchi had built up over half a century of successes and failures. The company started to become more rigid, more narrowly focused on the frontier of game design, and less inclined to draw influences from outside the world of video games. I don't think Iwata was a particularly rigid thinker, but the structure of Nintendo itself became streamlined and rationalized under his watch. Divisions that had a unique approach and vision were absorbed by the ever-expanding EAD, a process that was completed shortly after Iwata's passing. For better or for worse, Nintendo has changed a lot more in the last 30 years than it did in the previous 30. It's grown a lot more profitable and has reached a lot more people with its games in that time. But to do so, it's cut away a lot of the old baggage that used to make it feel special. Mario is more successful as a go-kart driver now than he is as a run-and-jump wahoo man. Zelda isn't confined to a restrictive but unique formula. Now it's an open-world sandbox game with crafting elements and a non-linear narrative. Everything has voice acting now, and rather than wishing you could hear what your favorite Nintendo characters sounded like, now you sometimes wish you could get them to shut up instead. And yet, the old Nintendo magic that Yamauchi represented hasn't completely disappeared, even after all this time. For a long time, Shigeru Miyamoto took on the same role inside Nintendo, the crotchety old guy who remembers everything that's ever happened and won't tolerate mediocrity. When I read about Yamauchi insisting that Gunpei Yokoi make more Game & Watch games instead of moving on, I was instantly reminded of Miyamoto telling the Super Mario Galaxy team that the concept deserved a second game, when all of them wanted to move on. He's also one of the few people at Nintendo who has a passion for products other than video games. Not ones I happen to be particularly fond of, but that's beside the point. Nintendo still has access to its distant past, which is extensively documented and cherished as a nostalgic memory by millions of people. That magic isn't dead, it's just dormant, and Nintendo can stir it back to life anytime it wants to. Over the past decade, it hasn't bothered, because it's found greater success by copying the competition. Which, to be fair, isn't something Yamauchi turned his nose up at either, when he could get away with it. The real question isn't whether the team at Nintendo can draw on their legacy of great toys, games, and electronic amusements to make something that feels new while holding on to the best of what's old. Of course they can do that. They're Nintendo. They've done it many times before, often in far more difficult circumstances. The real question is who or what is going to make them. As long as Nintendo is riding this roller coaster of success, it has no real incentive to change at all, let alone changing back to what it was in the past. Nintendo used to learn from its successes and its failures, but it hasn't had a real failure in a long time, not from a commercial perspective at least. And I do think there's a danger in store for any company that doesn't face small failures regularly, the way that Nintendo used to. It might get so set in its ways, so stiff and complacent, that when a failure does come, it snaps the whole organization in half. Obviously, I'm a biased observer, but I think the surest way for Nintendo to avoid a collapse is to keep its options open and its history in mind. Remember the toys Nintendo used to make, the games it used to play, the ups and downs of the time before Nintendo was a big shot known around the world. That memory is the real magic, and it would be a shame to let it die just because Nintendo doesn't need it right now. You never can tell when the cycle will swing back around and the old things become new again. Until that day comes, I'll be watching and waiting, and remembering. Thanks for watching, everybody.